Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. My name is Zaina Azam. I'm the executive director here, and I'm very happy to have all of you with us today. We are so pleased that our speaker, Noga Kadman, is with us today. She's in the United States doing a tour for her book, her new book, Race from Space and Consciousness, Israel and the Depopulated Palestinian Villages of 1948. We will have copies of the book for sale after the lecture. Noga Kadman will be talking about the findings of this book and her vast experience in researching the history of hundreds of depopulated Palestinian villages after the 1948 war, or the Palestinian Nakba. She asks, how have Israelis perceived this transformation, that is, the depopulation and at times erasure of Palestinian villages after 1948? Her remarks will include discussion of the complex phenomena of personal and collective memory, representation, tangible historical remains, the politics of naming, Israeli tourism, and the marginalization of the depopulated Palestinian villages in the Israeli discourse. This is all in her book. Our speaker will have the floor for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. And viewers online can tweet questions to us at Palestine Center. So let me introduce our speaker. Noga Kadman is an Israeli researcher in the field of human rights in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Her main interest is to explore the encounter between Israelis and the Palestinian presence in the landscape and history of the country. She's also a licensed tour guide who deals mostly with the hidden Palestinian layers of the landscape in Israel. She is co-editor of a book titled Once Upon a Land, a Tour Guide to Depopulated Palestinian Villages and Towns, and this is in both Hebrew and in Arabic. And most recently, the book which is the subject of her talk today, Erased from Space and Consciousness, Israel and the Depopulated Palestinian Villages of 1948. A hearty welcome to you, Noga. Please come up.
Thank you, Zaina and Samira and all that organized this event, and thank you for coming. Before I begin, I want to emphasize a few things. First, my research doesn't focus on the dispossession and uprooting of Palestinians, but how Israelis relate to that. Then, that what I'll talk about today is not unique to Israel. You can find similar practices in different places in the world where there is national conflict. So, of course, each place is different, but Israel didn't invent these kind of practices. And then, sometimes viewing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the outside, there's a tendency to divide the sides to victims and victimizers. And of course, the balance in power relations between Israelis and Palestinians is very unbalanced. But living the conflict from within, things are very complex, and in certain ways, people from both sides pay a price for this situation. I want to quote Professor Alon Confino from University of Virginia. He talks about how to write the history of 48. And he said that I would aspire for a history of 48 that seeks not to blame, score points, or divide the world into clear-cut perpetrators and victims, but instead acknowledges the complexity of human affairs, and that perpetrator and victim can be united in the same person. Holocaust survivors ended up expelling Arabs. Arabs denying the humanity of Jews ended up uprooted refugees. A little about me and the research and what brought me to deal with it. I grew up in Jerusalem to a Jewish Israeli family, and I live in a small community west of Jerusalem in the hills. And for years I was working in human rights, documenting human rights violations committed to Palestinians by Israel in the occupied territories. And this work led me to wanting to know more about the conflict and its history, and to understanding what are the refugee camps in the West Bank. What are these places? Where these people come from? and I began to study a master's degree focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And through that, I learned things that perhaps are obvious to you and obvious for me today, but came as a surprise. I learned that when I hear about Palestinians in Lebanon or in Jordan, they have not just another ethnic groups in those countries, but these are people that came from where I live, maybe even the same street or neighborhood in Jerusalem. And we use their lands, we use their houses, and we don't talk about them at all. And I learned to get to know better the places that they had to leave behind. For example, Lifta, a village now near the entrance to Jerusalem, today a very popular place for Israelis to visit for touristic reasons. So I came there many times as a child with school, with youth movement, and my perception of the place as a child was that this place has always been ruined and empty and silent and mysterious. And only years later I realized that not so long ago it was full of life, with families and children and animals, agricultural activity. And today when you go there, it's empty and there's no sign to what was there before. So this contradiction bothered me, and I wanted to learn more about the encounter between Israelis and the depopulated villages. So I conducted this research, and I focused on 4 aspects of this encounter. I checked if Israel gave official names to the depopulated villages, if they are put on Israeli official maps, what Israeli visitors, when they go to those tourism places where there are villages, what do they learn about the villages, if at all? And Jewish communities that were built on top of the ruins or inside the Arab empty houses, how do they relate to the villages and to the fact that they live in a depopulated village? So just a very brief historical background, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So before 48, Israel was predominantly, what it came to be Israeli-Palestine was a predominantly Arab country with a small Jewish minority that grew over the years. But until 48, the Palestinians were the big majority. And during the war of 48, they had to flee, mostly because military attacks on their communities or military attacks nearby or fear from attacks, sometimes direct deportations. And when Israel was established, after the war, in Israel remained over 400 empty villages where the Palestinians originated, also, of course, towns and cities, but I focus on the villages in this research. And the policy of Israel regarding the villages was, for the most part, to demolish them. This happened mostly by 49, sometimes during the war for military or strategic reasons. And then after Israel consciously decided not to allow the return of the refugees for political reasons, to demolish their houses, they will not have motivation to go back to those places. But remains of the villages stayed in the landscape well into the 50s and 60s. And at that time, when it was pretty obvious for Israel that the refugees are not going to return, Israel wanted to demolish those ruins for aesthetic reasons and diplomatic reasons. The remains of the villages were conceived as something that uglified the landscape, the new landscape that we were trying to create, and also something that is a remain of something that we don't really want to discuss, and something that raised questions among tourists. So there were several projects to demolish the remains of the villages well into the 60s. And today, most of the villages were leveled and not much remained of them, but in many places you can still see remains of walls, of structures, cacti bushes, orchard trees, and this became part of the landscape in Israel. The first thing I wanted to check is whether Israel gave official names to the depopulated villages. In Israel there is a governmental names committee that its role is to give official names to every feature on the ground, including ruins. So I went to the State Archive to read documents of this committee to see what was its policy regarding the Palestinian villages. Generally, giving names to places is not just a technical thing. In many conflicts, it is another arena in the conflict. And often after occupations, the occupying power erases their existing names and give its own names to the places as a way to declare its ownership over the places. And the same happened in Israel. The general policy of the Names Committee was to try to revive ancient names of the places that are mentioned in the Bible and in other historical sources, and to erase foreign names, what's called foreign names, which are mostly Arabic names. This was, of course, was a political act, and they were aware of it, and there are a few quotes to show that. The Names Committee, for example, said that the historical Hebrew names of the places in the lands of Israel are the most faithful testimony that these places belong to our forefathers since time immemorial, and our rights and claims on these places and the land are ancient historical ones. Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister, said we must remove the Arabic names due to political considerations. Just as we do not recognize the political ownership of the Arabs over the land, we do not recognize their spiritual ownership and their names. Now, regarding the villages, the committee at first didn't know what to do, because they're supposed to give names also to ruins, but those villages Israel ruined purposely. They didn't want them to stay, so should we give them official names? Ben-Gurion in 1951 decided that we should not name those places. These places are gone. When we built a new settlement there, we will give it a name. But not all the committee members were happy with this decision. Some felt that these places are still part of the history and geography of the country and should be named. So Ben-Gurion, after a year, agreed that we can give names to places that it's necessary to include in the map, which he meant, for the most part, that had more ancient history that we're interested in. The result was that most villages did not receive official names. Some villages, 69, received names. The ruins of the village received official name. In other cases, another site in the village site received a name like a mountain or a well or an ancient site. Also, where names were fixed to the villages in the minority of cases, this was not the original Arabic name that was recognized as official, but a Hebrew name that was given to the place. In 1/3 of the cases, the name was an ancient name of the place, mentioned in ancient sources, that the committee thought it identified with the Arab village. For example, the village of Bet Jibrin, the committee identified the ancient place of Bet Guvrin, so what they called revive the ancient name and call it as the new official name. In around half of the cases, the committee could not identify a specific ancient place, but it still wanted to give a name to the place. So what they did is that they slightly changed the sounds of the Arabic names. They didn't want to erase it completely, because many names like Bet Guvrin, Bet Jibrin, then the Arabic name preserved the ancient Hebrew name. So they didn't want to erase it. They changed the name so it will sound more Hebrew. Like instead of Khirbet Kumbaza, Khurbat Kipoz. And those Hebraized names often they don't have meaning in Hebrew at all. In a few cases, they translated the names from Arabic to Hebrew, and only 13 villages have their original Arabic name as the official name. And in these cases, the name also has meaning in Hebrew. The committee realized that it's not enough to fix new names. They also have to convince the public to use the new names. Because when Israel was established and the Jews there used what they knew about the places, the Arabic names. So the committee did all it could for giving the information about the new names to the public through writing to different institutions, media, governmental offices, municipalities, and urge them to use the new names. Here are a few examples. They wrote to a children's magazine, "Your newspaper is commanded to fulfill also the following mission. In addition to the love of the homeland, plant in the hearts of the children the knowledge of the language of the homeland, Hebrew names instead of Arabic one. You do not always insist on that, and the Arabic names appear on more than one occasion." They wrote to the bus company Egged that used the old Arabic names in the bus station signs. "Your insistence on the Arabic names is neither commendable nor legal. You are failing the public and misleading it with names that have been completely and decisively abolished, and you are interfering with the instilling of the Hebrew names." The work of the committee eventually succeeded, and gradually the Arabic names were forgotten for the most part, and the Hebrew names are in use in Israel today. One of the goals of the giving Hebrew names was to create a Hebrew map. When Israel was established, the official maps were British maps. The British collected the names of the places that were in use among the local population, mostly Palestinian population, all the names of villages, streams, mountains, and 90% of the names of the map were Arabic names. When Israel was established, it first used the British maps as official maps, but those maps didn't fit what Israel wanted to use, because first it was not a Hebrew map, and also it showed a reality that no longer exists on the ground. It showed hundreds of villages that were demolished. So what Israel did until the 60s, it used the British maps, but it updated them with the new information. They put a sign demolished near the villages that were demolished, and they put new Jewish settlements that were built on village lands. And only after the Names Committee finished to give names to all the features on the ground, official Hebrew names, only then in the 60s Israel produced its own Hebrew official maps. I wanted to see what Israelis, when they look at official maps, what they see, if they see the villages marked there or not, in what ways. I checked a series of official hiking maps, very popular among travelers in Israel, at least before they had Google Maps and such things. And I located all the Palestinian villages on those maps. And I checked whether the Palestinian village was shown on the map originally. I found out that in most cases, the Palestinian villages do appear on the map in some way or another, but around 40% do not appear at all, and 64% don't have the names on the map. Some have only a sign of a ruin, which doesn't say what's the identity of this ruin, and when it was demolished, could have been a Roman ruin as well. In the minority of cases where there are names of villages in the maps, it's usually the Hebrew name or the Hebraized name of the village. And only in 15% of the cases, the Arabic name appear on the map. So this is a reflection of the situation on the ground. The villages were demolished, so their names are not on the map. But it's also a reflection of ideological decisions. There are villages that left traces on the ground, but they are not mapped, even though the surveyor of Israel who produced the maps is supposed to map every feature on the ground, including such places that left remains. While there are ancient places that are mapped, even though they didn't leave much on the ground, because their history is considered more important for Israel. Using this map, I could find how many villages are today within nature reserves, national parks, recreational forests inside Israel. And I found out that almost half of the villages, almost 200, are within such sites today. For example, parks or forests of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, or national parks, nature reserves, private resorts, or villages that are crossed by a hiking path. These places are accessible to Israelis, and there, in those places, there is a physical encounter between Israelis and the remains of the villages. But this encounter is mediated by the authorities that manage those places, which are mostly the National Park Authority, NPA, and the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. So I visited all those places, and I want to see what information is delivered to the visitors about the village. If it is mentioned that there was a village here, and what they say about it. So I checked all the signs and brochure distributed to the visitors, and also other publications about those places and the websites of the organizations. I found out that in most cases, these texts ignore completely the villages, or they don't put signs and don't produce brochures where there are villages, or they have signs that ignore the village. An example is a park Ramat Menashe, which is a JNF park south of Haifa. In the general description of the park, they said that there are planted natural forests there, open space, gentle slopes, fields and orchards, springs and streams, rural settlements, which I mean rural Jewish settlements, archaeological and Zionist site. And they don't mention 7 villages that the remains are today within the boundaries of these parks, which I marked in yellow, and they're not originally on the map. When the villages are mentioned in the minority of cases, it is done in passing and partially without giving details about the villages, like for how long they existed, how many people lived there, what they did for their living, what happened to them in 48. The villages sometimes are not mentioned as Arabs, but just as a village, and never as Palestinians. And sometimes a village is mentioned without a name. Sometimes there are folkloristic description of villages, describing their customs, religious traditions, without mentioning what happened to them in 48. Here is our examples. In Tel Achish National Park, there is a text about the demon tree, the only tree remaining on the hill, probably due to its sanctity to the residents of Kubeba, an Arab village that stood on the hill until 48. According to the legend, the villagers of Kubeba would send their children to bring water from the well, and to make sure they came back quickly, would tell them a demon lived on the plum tree, guarding the water. Bringing water from the well thus becomes a test of courage for the village children. Without saying why the village stood there only until 48 and what happened to the children after that year. Sometimes the text refers to structures that remain from the village without saying that they belong to a certain village. For example, the church in the village of Kafir Birem now is in the boundaries of Bar'am National Park, which was declared because of excavations of ancient remains in a synagogue, ancient synagogue that was discovered there. The text of NPA advises visitors to leave the synagogue and walking up a nearby hill, topped with a Maronite church. Try identifying the animal on the lintel. Did you guess? It's the kangaroo, which carries its offspring in its pouch and protects them as the church protects its followers. We will then ascend the building in front of the church for a spectacular vista of the Meron Mountain Nature Reserve all around us. The text doesn't say anything about the village of Bar'am to which the church belonged. It doesn't say that the people of Kafir Birem were displaced as Israeli citizens just a few kilometers away, and till today they're waging a struggle to return to their former village and even gain the support of the Supreme Court, but they're still not being allowed to return there. The texts tend to focus on Jewish history, either ancient Jewish history and more contemporary Zionist history, often while ignoring what was in between, at least hundreds of years of Palestinian history. An example is Sataf, a village near Jerusalem, today a JNF recreational area where the JNF leases plots of lands from the village to Israelis who grow vegetables there. And the text of JNF talks about the 2 springs, water agricultural terraces, a reminder of an almost vanished ancient Hebrew culture thousands of years old. Here, just like the ancient Israelites at the time, people tend irrigated vegetable gardens alongside orchards that require no irrigation. This is a hidden gem, as if stop the time from passing. And of course, the last people who made a living of these orchards and terraces were the Palestinians that are not mentioned. In JNF forests, there are many commemoration stones, either for Jewish communities that were lost in the Holocaust or donors that gave money to the JNF. And there isn't any commemoration to Palestinian communities and villages, even if they used to stand right where the commemoration stones stand today. And sometimes those stones were taken from the buildings, demolished buildings of the Palestinian villages. The texts tend to glorify the natural beauty of the places without mentioning 48 and the villages. Carmel Coast Forest, south of Haifa, is described as one of the most magical places in the country. Many spots of grace and beauty, magical atmosphere like a fairy tale. with no mention of 3 villages that used to stand there until 48. Sometimes the villages themselves in other texts are described as part of this natural beauty. The village of En Razal in the photo, the JNF said that the ruins of this village are adorning the slope. And another text talk about the depopulated villages of Kudna as a picturesque ruin. Sometimes the villages are mentioned as landmarks in the landscape, like mountains and streams that when directing hikers to go there, without further elaborating on the village. For example, we should walk up the hill on a trail rising between the terraces and orchard trees to Agur ruin, which is Hebrai's name of the village, the big village of Ajur, which no information is given about in the text. In the sites of the villages, many orchard trees remain, and sometimes they became part of the cultivated features of the park, the established park in the place. And the text used to describe those orchards, often without mentioning the people that used to own them and made a living from them. A text of JNF talks about a flora unit, which is extraordinary in its vitality and importance, the abandoned orchards that tend to grow beneath terraces, without mentioning the villages they belong to. The texts often do mention the War of 48 as part of what in Israel is called the battle legacy, what is considered desirable to provide information about past wars and battles to the newer generation. But in this context, the villages are described either as targets for occupation or as hostile and violent against Jews, without talking about them also as civil communities. And when villages are described as violent, they're also identified as Arabs, which is not always the case. But all the references to 48 and to the war, there isn't also an explanation why the places were depopulated, what happened to them. In the village of Kisaria, for example, today within National Park, Kisaria National Park, and it was the first village whose residents were deported intentionally by Dagana already in January 48. And the sign in the place only says that the village did not last for long. And this is the village of Deir el-Hawa near Jerusalem. The text says that in 48 the village was occupied by the Palmach Harel Brigade during Operation Mountain. A visit to the mountain at sunset is astonishingly beautiful. All those texts don't mention military attacks against the villages that caused the depopulation of most of them, don't mention massacre cases and deportation, don't mention refugees and what happened to the people after 48 until today. In Ein el-Zaytun in the Galilee, for example, according to historian Benny Morris, Palmach unit expelled women, elderly, and children by shooting over the heads. Around 70 men from the village and other villages nearby were gunned down into a nearby creek, their hands tied, following instruction of a local battalion commander. Meanwhile, Palmach units blew up and burned houses in the village. And all this doesn't appear in the sign that JNF put near the remains of the village, which only say in this context that the village was a base for Arab fighters and was occupied by the Palmach. The texts never say why the village was demolished, by whom, and in what way, even though, of course, it's evident by visiting the place that it's a demolished place. The last subject I'll talk about is rural Jewish communities built on the populated villages. In the first years of Israel, around 700,000 Jewish immigrants came to the country, almost the number of Palestinians who were displaced from the country. Many of those immigrants were themselves refugees or displaced, either Holocaust survivors from Europe or Jews from Arab countries that had to leave and left all they had behind. Around a third of those immigrants settled in empty houses, in Palestinian houses in cities and towns. And there was also an official attempt to settle immigrants in the populated villages. The Jewish Agency located dozens of villages and made them more or less habitable, and established kibbutzim and moshavim, Jewish agricultural cooperative communities in those places. The living conditions for the immigrants in those places were very, very difficult. Many houses were not in a good shape, no doors and windows, no electricity, no running water. It was often isolated and far from cities and towns where people could find work. And often near the border, where sometimes Palestinians tried to return and take their belongings and harvest their crops, and there were tense encounters. Many people who could abandon these places. And also at some point, there was an official decision of the settlement movement that the Arab village, the way it is built, it doesn't fit the modern agricultural community we want to establish. So most of those places were abandoned. They built a new Jewish community 1 or 2 kilometers away and demolished the village. But still, today, still 44 Palestinian villages are in the boundaries of Jewish rural settlements that were built on what used to be the built-up area of the village, or on part of it, either on the ruins or inside the houses that many still exist today. I wanted to check those people who settled in these houses and in these places, how they felt about living in a depopulated village and how they related to this fact and to the village. So I read publication of these places, mostly kibbutzim and moshavim, in their archives and publication like newsletters, anniversary publication about the place, and the websites. I found out that the fact that the kibbutz or moshav was built on an Arab village is a well-known fact. It's always mentioned as part of this description of the place. But other than that, the texts generally ignore the village, don't provide details about it, like its history, what happened with it in 48, and so forth. For example, in kibbutz Sasa, established in the village of Sasa near the border with Lebanon by American Jews, the ID of the kibbutz says kibbutz Sasa, name kibbutz Sasa, birthplace, the abandoned village of Sasa. And Moshav Kerem Ben Zimra, also in the Galilee, the general review of the Moshav says that it was built on the ruins of Arab village of Ras El Ahmar. And such description you can find in all description of such communities. When the texts do refer to the villages, it's generally in the context of the use they made by with the remains of the village, mostly houses. Kibbutz Iron, for example, wrote, "We have refurbished 17 residential rooms and some 10 service structures, all of those in the buildings of the village of Saliha, which we refurbished for the temporary usage and named Iron." Kibbutz Bet Guvrin, established on the Palestinian village of Bet Jibrin, shows in its newsletter remnants of the Arab village that served as a laundry room. Sometimes in the Jewish community, they refer to a specific Arab house that had a special role in the history of the community. Sometimes it's the only structure that remained from the village. Sometimes it's a relatively big structure. And they tend to write about it in a nostalgic way for the first years of their settlement, as if those places didn't have previous history. Moshav Abonim, built on Kafir Elam, for example, talks about the Mukhtar's house and how it served the Moshav as general kitchen, volunteer kitchen, carpentry workshop, club, storeroom, sewing workshop, and the house has remained the nerve center of the Moshav. Kibbutz Megiddo also wrote a poem in the photo devoted to the Arab village of the kibbutz. As I wrote, "When we came here in February 49, we looked at you, house, to find a spark of hope and a glimmer of light. You, the one and only, whom we call the Arab house. For without you, we would be lost and as the homeless." When the first settlers arrived, they found the orchard, what they call the abandoned orchard of the Palestinians, and they tried to cultivate them and make a living from them. And they wrote about it a lot, and they refer to those orchards as their own. Kibbutz Harel, for example, writes about the Beji's Grove. It looks lovely. The olive bloom is gradually turning into fruit. It seems a large crop is forthcoming. Our groves are the most beautiful in the area. We accept serious income from this grove. And in Kibbutz Bet HaEmek, in the photo, many ancient olive trees from the village of Koikat remained inside the kibbutz, on the kibbutz lawns. And the kibbutz developed a special tradition where the youth of the kibbutz collect olives every year and sell them and use this money to help funding their road trips to Poland, visiting concentration camps and learning about the Holocaust. And the kibbutz decided that the olives are the property of the kibbutz and trusted to the youth to sponsor the Poland project. Other references to the village in community publications is their aspiration to turn the village from Arab to Jewish, from backward to modern, to make the desolate and empty and ruined place they arrived at blooming, and to change the Arab landscape that is conceived as a negative thing for them. In most of the publication, I didn't find a feeling of discomfort or dilemma about living in a depopulated village. But some kibbutzim publications do have these kinds of references. For example, Kibbutz Yiron, when we reached the place where Yiron was to be established, the Arab village induced a gloomy mood in me. It was a place that one could see that it has been abandoned not so long ago, and many houses displayed signs of looting. In Kibbutz Kabri, when you see what happened to the Arab village of Kabri, which stood where it did for hundreds of years and was a home for people and children, and here it stands devastated and desolate, and all its residents scattered all over, your heart aches, and you feel how negatively tragic this is. And Kibbutz Kabri, by the way, the people from Kabri originally were in another kibbutz near the Dead Sea, and they had to leave the kibbutz in 48 as well, and it was during the war, and were even recognized as refugees by UNRWA at the time. And they established Kabri, Kibbutz Kabri, on the remains of El Kabri. But there was only one community that really dealt with the moral dilemma very intensively, and this is Kibbutz Sasa in the north of Israel. This is the village of Sasa, and when the kibbutz was established in 49, it was established right in the Arab houses by American Jews. American Jews who used to belong to Shomer HaTzair youth movement, the left-wing youth movement. And they, in the writing, deal a lot with this dilemma and the struggle with what they see as contradiction between their ideology and this reality. For example, they wrote, "Here we were, American Jewish pioneers, come to help build a new homeland and create a new society. We were bred on American fair play and a Shomer HaTzair binationalism, living in harmony with our Arab brothers. It was bad enough living in the village where you could almost feel their presence, where part of their possessions were left behind, with a storeroom filled with last season's crop. If all this was not enough to burst our ideological bubble, there was the problem of what to do with the mosque. Because when they settled the place, the mosque was still there. And the Israeli army put pressure on them to get rid of the mosque. And the people of Sasa were split. Some thought that we could not do that. This is not ours. We use their property. We should collect money and send it to a refugee fund in Lebanon. And as I said, when we use the property anyway, and we don't need the mosque, it's hypocrisy. We should just get rid of it. Eventually, the army didn't decide for the decision of the kibbutz and just blew the mosque itself. The kibbutz Sasa even devotes part of its traditional Passover Haggadah to the Palestinian village and to this dilemma of living in it. This part is symbolized by the bitter herb and is traditionally devoted to the suffering of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. In this version of Sasa, it says, our herb is a very bitter one, and even if we should succeed in removing all other physical traces of it, its taste will linger. Once there was an our village here. The fields we tend today were tended by others 1 year ago. And when we came, the desolation of the life cried to us through the ruins they left behind. What gives us the right to reap the fruit of trees we have not planted, to take shelter in houses we have not built, to till the soil preserved by the sweat of foreign hands? On what moral grounds shall we stand when we take ourselves to court? But Kibbutz Sasa eventually stayed where it did, and the other communities as well. And the different communities gave different justifications to why it's okay to live in our village. Some say that it's their fault, they chose to flee. Kibbutz Karmia, for example, says that there were homes here, our hats actually, it did not bother me. They fled and it was their fault. They had listened to the Mufti, and I do not pity them. Kibbutz Sasa saw it as a matter of self-defense. We're not responsible for this cruel and forced contradiction, but we have been forced into a position where we must fight for our lives and the lives of our people. And today, life is largely determined by frontiers, and frontier must be defended no matter what the price. In Kibbutz Karbi, they saw it as an inevitable result of war, that the village was abandoned by its residents after a murderous assault by the locals on a convoy that broke through the siege on Kibbutz Yechiam. Maybe some of the villagers did not support the action and did not take active part in it, but when fire begins to burn, it burns everything, damp and dry. So generally, the discourse among Jewish communities built on depopulated villages is not as we saw in Sasa. This is an exception. Generally, the discourse accepts the situation of living in a dispossessed village. And part of it, I guess, is because those settlers were themselves refugees. They struggled in a very difficult way, accepting the loss of the world they had to leave behind and building a new world, and they struggle with getting adjusted to a new place and the survivor. And maybe it's not coincidence that the only kibbutz that had the moral dilemma is Kibbutz Sasa, built not by refugees, but by people who came from a prosperous country like the United States, but because they chose to come. So to conclude, in all the aspects that I checked, I found marginalization and erasure of the Palestinian villages from the Israeli consciousness. And the result is that for Israelis, their picture of their country is a picture of a Jewish country with very little Arab history and geography. And this, of course, didn't happen by itself. It happens through the work of different mechanisms that we showed here that build the collective memory of Israelis. And this, of course, it influences the political viewpoint of Israelis today, because the tragedy of Palestinians in 48 and what they lost because of the creation of Israel is not part of the picture that Israelis see as a part of the conflict. And therefore, it's not part of what they see should be the solution. And I believe that no matter what the solution should be, it's very important to see with open eyes what happened in the past, to take responsibility for our part in it, and to try to seek redress for the harms that were caused. Thank you, and I'll be happy to hear.
Thank you so much, Noga, for this very enlightening and stimulating presentation. This is a time for our questions and discussion period. So if you could raise your hand, I'll call on you and try to make, if you have remarks, make them brief and just come right to your question. Yes, sir. And can you hold on until we get the microphone?
Thank you very much. It was a very disturbing talk. I just had a couple of questions. Are there still records of Palestinian land ownership in Israel, or were they destroyed? And the second question, what's going on in the West Bank? Can Palestinians own land in the West Bank? And when a settlement is built, let's say, do they just expropriate the land or they try to buy it? Those are my two questions. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Israel doesn't deny the fact that most of the land inside Israel used to be Palestinian private land. They just decided that after the war, they made a census, and those that are absent, their property is considered absentee property and is appropriated by the state. So, yes, there are records, but the law, the Israeli contemporary law, is that this is a matter of the past, and today it's state property. And about the West Bank, yeah, Palestinians own private land in the West Bank. The settlements in the past, in the beginning, were built on Palestinian private land. But then the Supreme Court ruled against that, and that was in the 70s. And since that point, most of the settlements are established on what is considered state land. So there's lots of effort, this used to be, to declare state lands on land that is not being worked on and then it's kind of empty. Sometimes it used to be private land, but settlements for the most part are built on what is considered state land.
Yes, sir. Can you wait for just a moment?
Would you like the microphone?
Oh, thank you very much. That was very interesting. One question which, I mean, you didn't touch on it, but it would be interesting to know how many Arabs died as a result of the war and how many were actually basically forced to relocate, and what percentage of the total Arab population would that constitute? Or have you got those statistics, or are they even available?
About the number of people killed, I'm not sure. We always learn how many Jews were killed, which is 6,000 in 48, and I think the number of Palestinians killed is obviously larger than that. I don't know, I think I heard the number 20,000, but I'm not sure. And about the people who became refugees, it's around 750,000 Palestinians, and around 150,000 Palestinians remained in Palestine, in what became Israel, and received Israeli citizenship.
Yes, sir.
What has been the reception among in your discipline and among the government or others to your work, which I thought was brilliant research?
Thank you. This work was first published in Hebrew, as a book in Hebrew, in Israel. Generally, I received very good reception for the book, good reviews and interested audience, but this doesn't reflect the mainstream opinion on such matters, which generally sees those things as negative and against our interest as Israelis. I think 1,000 copies, or something like, more. The first edition was 1,000, as they made a second edition, so it's 1,000 something.
Hi, Noga. I recently read Suad Amari's book, Golda Slept Here, and where she recounts attempts by Palestinians whose homes were confiscated, mainly in West Jerusalem, and how the relatives of the former owners attempt to actually go to the homes and in some cases actually talk to the current occupants. I don't know if you've read the book. Needless to say, they don't have much luck in doing so, and one woman was actually arrested. I note that you said that you reviewed publications of the kibbutzim and moshavim. I was wondering if you've ever actually talked to current inhabitants of homes, individuals, particularly from different generations, the ones who occupied the homes right after the Nakba, and then maybe the next generation or two, to see what their views are.
Yeah, I did it not as part of the research because I tried to avoid any confrontation and didn't want to deal with that. But going there, and I talked with archivists, and some people also contacted me from these communities after the publication of the book. So yes, and there are, so from the first generation, all these quotes of feeling of discomfort and dilemma are from the first generation of the kibbutzim and moshavim, because they had this really more direct encounter with the village, still with the belonging of the refugees there, and sometimes meeting the refugees who are trying to return. And the second and third generation don't have that. This is like old history. They know the place used to be Arab, but they live in a Jewish community. For them, it was always Jewish. So I had a conversation with people from the older generation, and they are aware of the contradiction of this complex situation, but at the same time, they built the place for themselves. It's like from scratch, and they're very proud of their community. And they think it's unfortunate that this is the situation, that it has to be on the expense of others, but like they wrote, we didn't choose it. It's war. And people see it, and also people in 48 saw it as a matter of life or death, or we win, and unfortunately others suffer, or they win and we have to go somewhere else.
Can we come to the front?
Where are all the Palestinians that were killed in 48 buried?
I don't know. I guess some were buried in their communities by people that were still there, like in Palestinian cities and villages, and other. I think some were buried by Israeli forces, like in mass graves and things like that.
Do you think the Israelis will ever take any responsibility for what happened in 48?
I hope. I think that's the only way we can get somewhere, but not in the near future.
Hi. Just to return to the question of reception, beyond your book, but just in general, is there like growing knowledge in Israel about this history? Does it like pop up? Do Israelis see it and not see it at the same time?
Yeah, there are two simultaneous trends in Israel. One is, and they're related, because there is growing awareness. Like 15 years ago, nobody in Israel knew the word Nakba, never heard it, didn't know what it means. Now everybody knows what Nakba is. They know it's something negative, but they know what it means. And so there are more and more Israelis, also in the academia, there are more and more writings about these kind of things. More and more people want to know and are interested. And I get inquiries, but people were not involved in the Israeli-Palestinian, in the conflict or in the Palestinian cause, but they learned that where they used to live, it used to be a Palestinian place, and they're very interested, and they want to connect with the former residents, and they call me and ask me what I know about the place. So there is interest, but at the same time, because there is growing knowledge, there is a lot of official opposition to that, with all those laws that are against mentioning the Nakba as a mourning day and such. So it's go both direction. And also in schools, in my time, we didn't learn anything about the Nakba and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. We learned about the wars, but not about what happened to the people. And now it's changing. Now there are textbooks that talk about the history in a more balanced way, but it's still in the margins and still very controversial.
I'd like to follow up on that. Ari Shavit, who wrote My Promised Land, has actually come to DC several times to speak. He's done a lot of speaking in the US, and I believe his book, which does touch on depopulation of certain villages, of course, not overall, is only written in English, from what I remember. And that he has been making one of his main assertions, of course, is that yes, this happened, but we had to do it. We wouldn't be here. That issue you mentioned about life or death.
Yes.
So I'm wondering about that issue, and with the growing recognition, is it moving more toward what he seems to be promoting, which is, yes, recognition, but it was justified. And I'm wondering about that aspect.
Yeah, I think you have both direction. Like Benny Morris, who documents in an excellent way all this from the official Israeli side, he tend to say that it's justified. But most people that I know that deal with these things deal because it disturbs them, because they think it's not right and it should have been done in a different way. So this is why they want to learn what happened.
Thank you very much. Could you say something about what is happening in terms of erasure and renaming and so on in that portion of the West Bank, which the Israelis have said is part of Jerusalem and is commonly known as East Jerusalem and that area around there?
In East Jerusalem, there wasn't direct deportation, but there are attempts to make life of people there hard, and lots of restrictions and negligence and discrimination. And when people, if they live several years outside of Jerusalem, they might lose their status. So there is an attempt. Yeah, that is happening too. Right, yes. Yeah.
I guess what people have been asking about is the political implications of recognizing what was done. What are they for you? What do you think, once you acknowledge this, what does it mean politically? What should be done about it? I mean, it happened and we did it, but what does it mean for you politically?
Yeah.
What are the consequences of that?
Mm-hmm.
It's all right. Actually, I wrote the history of all these villages before myself in the book that was edited by Walid Khalid.
Mm-hmm.
So I was familiar with all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's. But I would know your point of view on this. I've been in Morris actually said we should expel them even. I mean, he goes farther now, not just. In any case.
I think that the things that happened are crimes, but I think we cannot bring history back and go back to the same situation of 48 because this is impossible, and we should not cause more harms that were done. I think we should acknowledge that these are Palestinian places and they were taken away from them, and they have the right to choose if to go back. It's not always will be possible to go back to the same place or the same house because other people live there and they should not be deported unless they agree to receive compensation. Or if they want to stay where they are, and if they want to stay where they are, they should have be full citizens where they are and be able to run normal life where they are. Or they choose to receive compensation. They should have the choice. And this should be part of any political solution to the conflict.
Since you're a licensed guide, I was curious to know who takes your tours. I know the organization Zakrat often offers tours that I guess both Israelis and former Palestinian residents will take. But what kind of people are you leading, and what kind of reception do you get for that work?
It's mainly groups from abroad, from the US and Europe, that are interested in this kind of topics. They come to learn about the conflicts. They usually spend most of the time in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and also want to learn more about 48 and the Nakba and how Israel relate to it today. But there are also sometimes Israeli groups, even school groups, that their teacher are interested to give this aspect also. And they want the children to visit those places and to learn what happened. Not that I know.
How about American Jews who were interested in this?
Yeah, also American Jews. Yeah, sometimes American Palestinians or interfaith communities.
All right, go ahead. Thank you. First of all, thank you. I was wondering what you feel would be what you would like to see. You mentioned that you go to these communities and the signs that are there don't say what the village was or what happened, and likewise the maps. So what would you like to see in terms of signage, and what do you think people can, how far do you think that could go into the background without becoming subject to vandalism, or how much can be said? What would you like to see?
I like to see even objective description of what was there, even for people who are not don't mind the Palestinian cause. Some people, like in the Names Committee, they see this place as part of the history and the geography of the country, and we want to receive full information about those places. So if I receive information that this place was Roman and a Hellenistic place, I want to know also that it was a Palestinian place for many years. So at least to receive the facts in a balanced way, according to what was during the history. And the other organization that was mentioned is trying to push in this direction and to make the JNF put in its signs information about the village. And yes, there is vandalism against those signs.
In Marja Shahidi's Palestine Walks, he makes even a larger claim that the project now of the government is to just level the topography in talking about the wadi, the disappearance of the private highways. So that's the question. But the question is, what is Sector A, if I remember correctly, and why can't that be mapped? I'm trying to remember precisely.
You mean Area A?
Yeah, it's a sector in which Shahid worked on land use for a long time. And so there was one sector that could not be mapped.
I read the book, but I don't know what you refer to.
Hi, thank you. A few quick things. One, actually, with the settlements in the West Bank, many of them are, in fact, expanding onto private land.
Yeah.
So it's not just state land at all.
Yeah.
And the question would be, what state, if it's supposedly the West Bank and going to be a Palestinian state? Second, did you mention Zokrot and the app that they have, the phone app for? Because that would be interesting. I think it's great. And there has been a recent play, I think last year in Israel, called The Admission, which is specifically about Israelis admitting to depopulating, ethnically cleansing, and assassinating people in Palestinian villages inside Israel. Though interestingly, the play ends with no admission. And last thing, there is a move by a very small number of people, but some people in Israel, of looking at the depopulated villages as a potential site for Palestinians to return. Not only return from outside, but also inside. I mean, many people are living next to their village, but they're not allowed to go back there.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on that too.
Yes, by the way, those state lands in the West Bank, even if it's state land, it's supposed to use the Palestinian public. State land are public land, they're supposed to serve the public and not people from the occupying power that is not supposed to be there. Yeah, Zohrot initiated an application that's called iNakba in smartphones, where you have the map of Israel with all the villages the depopulated villages marked. So when you go around Israel, you can find what villages are around. It used to stand till 48. And there are, by the way, also by Zochrot, attempts to make like truth committees where people talk about their experiences in 48, both Jews and Arabs, so including Palmach veterans. They talk about what they did in 48. And yeah, there were around 20,000 of the refugees were displaced inside Israel. They stayed in what became Israel and received Israeli citizenship, but they lost their village and their houses and were not allowed to return. And they still identify with their former village. They live in what they call host communities. And there is growing struggle in the last 15 years or so of these communities to return. And this includes Kafir Birim that we saw before. And some of them submitted a petition to the Supreme Court because Israel kind of cheated them. They were citizens and they were told they have to leave the village for 2 weeks because of military practices, and then they can return, and they could never return. And even the Supreme Court said that they should return, and but the governments keep denying it. So, yeah, of course, they should be part of those that should allow to return, because now they are Israeli citizens and they cannot choose where they want to live. They lost all the property. It's also an economical matter, because all the lands they used to have are in those places and they were appropriated. So they live in host communities without having their own lands and property like other Palestinians that still manage to retain the property.
We have a question from an online audience member. Is environmental policy used as justification for demolishing villages?
In the past or now? Now there I don't know if it's environmental, but there are places, especially in the south, in the Negev, that the JNF wants to plant forests and make parks, and sometimes there are Bedouin communities living there, and Israel consider their presence there illegal because it doesn't recognize their communities there. So there are attempts to evict and demolish those communities, and sometimes with the pretext of this should be a park. So this happens, yes.
Let's go to you, and then Sharif, did you want to make a comment about the? Okay, hold on 1 second. Yes.
My question takes a rather different tack, and you never know what's a conspiracy theory or what's truth. I heard several times that in the 1982 war in Lebanon, that a building in Beirut was repeatedly bombed as a very important target, and it had no tactical or strategical importance. And the information was that in this building there were important archives with lots of deeds to property from the Ottoman times, and there were maps similar to the one you showed, which clearly demonstrated where the villages were.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true, or does anybody know anything about that?
I definitely don't know. I didn't hear about it, and I don't know. I really don't know.
Institute for Palestine
Yeah, just want to make 2 comments. One, on the question of the state land, in the West Bank. This is really a very complicated legal question, but there is a basic problem in Israel actually saying these are state lands, because Israel does not recognize the West Bank as occupied area, because it says actually the United Nations did not recognize the Jordanian rule over the West Bank before 1967. Yet they say we use the Jordanian law to say these are state lands. So if you do not accept actually that Jordan had a legal jurisdiction there, how do you use their law? So there is a really basic problem here. The other question about environmental policy, I think what Israel does is use actually very lofty environmental language to justify what they do. If you mentioned here Lifta, right? I mean, the way they describe what they are going to do for Lifta, it is a national park to restore, is a kind of conservationist project. So they do use actually environmental language to cover up what they want to cover up. The JNF itself, the Jewish National Fund, which did all this stuff basically, right? All a lot of the forests and all that stuff is now recognized, or it had managed to get itself recognized as an environmental organization. Yeah. And so they do actually use the environment, not environmental policy, but actually environmental rhetoric.
Yeah. About occupation, no. The official stance of Israel is this is an occupied territory, and that there are different interpretations of the international law, but Israel officially says that this is an occupied territory, and therefore the Jordanian law should apply there. This is like legally. So when it's comfortable for them, they use the Jordanian law. When it's not, they change it. But nowadays, in the past it was different. Nowadays, officially the state attorneys acknowledge occupation, maybe or belligerent occupation, or how the term is. And yeah, the environmental excuse also is used in the West Bank, refusing to plan communities in Area C, sometimes from a reason of that this is a nature reserve, or this was an archaeological site, so this place cannot be recognized as a Palestinian community. And in Lifta, actually the plan now is to build a luxurious neighborhood. And the idea is not to demolish Lifta. Lifta is the only village that stayed with many houses still standing, empty. So the idea of this neighborhood is to preserve the Palestinian houses, because now in Israel there is acknowledgement of the beautiful architecture of the Palestinian villages, not as it was in the past. So to preserve them, but also to add like 200 more buildings and to make it a luxurious neighborhood.
Okay. We're running out of time. We'll take one more question, and that will be the last one.
I would like to salute you for your commendable research. I was born in Upper Galilee in a village called Al-Khalisa, which is now called Kiryat Shmona. I went back there 10 years ago. I wanted to visit my father's grave. Only the mosque stands in my village. No Palestinian graves whatsoever. I was not allowed to visit the mosque. And my understanding is that there is an Israeli law against destroying cemeteries. Do you have any feedback on that?
At the time, during the war or just afterwards, it changed from place to place. Some places they made an attempt not to demolish cemeteries and mosques and churches, and other places they did demolish them. But now they do recognize cemeteries and sacred places, and they are supposed to be restored. But in many places it's too late. Those places were already ruined and leveled.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Noga Kadman. You've been, you're doing the documentation, the research, the writing, and now the dissemination, and we thank you for this very, very important work, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.